So let them know if somebody shows up, they can call. Tell me when. Hi, this is George Gruhn from Gruhn Guitars for our weekly question and answer session. But before I get into any listener questions, I'd like to first say that in our view, the coronavirus pandemic is not over, but certainly is more under control to the point where we now are taking appointments for visitors. And we're really pretty flexible on that. It's not like you're gonna have to make an appointment a day or even a week in advance or even an hour in advance. If you just call and let us know that you wanna come, in most cases, we're gonna be able to accommodate you. And at the very worst, if we have 3 or more people visiting at a time, you may have to wait a little while, but it would not be a long wait. So if somebody does come, you can call our phone number 615-256-2033. And you can also just show up and ring the doorbell. And if we have nobody in there in the showroom other than our employees, we'll be able to accommodate you. But we're not just simply advertising to the general public that we are wide open yet. And basically, right now, we're just going to have to see how it goes as far as traffic. But what we find now is it is productive to be open by appointment in this manner. And our online service, telephone, email, and online, has been uninterrupted throughout the entire pandemic. We have always been staffed to answer the phone, emails, online orders, shipping and receiving. So we were never truly, totally closed. But if you do make an appointment, we'd like for it to be no more than 1 person plus a friend, but not a large group. If you don't have a face mask, we do have some that we can provide. And you will need to use hand sanitizer, which we have before playing instruments. And again, practicing social spacing within the building when you are here. But all staff members will be wearing face masks in contact with the public. And instruments will be cleaned and after they are played. Now for reader questions. The first is from Dan Tilney. What are you going to do with your store, parentheses, great business, if and when you ever retire? Well, I'm having too much fun to really want to retire. I've been collecting instruments since 1963, and I've had the store since January 1970. I will be 75 years old, August 21st of this year. But my great uncle Otto lived to be 102, and his sister Emma only made it to 101, but neither one of them ever really truly retired. They remained active, and they both made their money primarily in stock market trading, which they never gave up. Otto invested heavily in the stock market at the depth of the Great Recession, and he made $5 million at it back then, which multiplied by about 60 to know what that means. But he was my great uncle, so I didn't inherit that. But the immediate family did, which proves you can't take it with you, because if anybody would have, he did. He would have been the one. At any rate, I am CEO of this business, and I do come in daily, but my stepson Eric, right here, is company president and general manager, and has been working now for well over a decade, and is in 16 years. So in fact, 16 years with Eric, he knows this business backwards and inside out. And it means that as company president and general manager, he is handling much of the day-to-day operations, whereas I remain very active, still involved with appraisals and buying and selling, research and writing. I keep a very full schedule, but the day-to-day operation is Eric's job, and it is a very full-time job. So plans for the future, if and when I ever did retire or were incapacitated for any reason whatever, Eric is the one who will inherit this business. And I expect that he will do a fine job at it because he's already doing a fine job at it. Gruhn Guitars is here for the long haul. And we like what we do, and we're going to keep at it. It's way too much fun to get out. So the next question, Jeff Thompson in Salmon, Idaho. Would you give us your opinion regarding the Martin F50, F55, and F65 guitars? I know they were only made for a few years in the mid-1960s. Do players or collectors value them today? I have an F50. It is number 184817. Well, first, as far as figuring the date of your guitar, handy dandy serial number list right here, 184. That was made in 1962. These guitars were made from 1961 through 1965. They made both single cutaway models and double cutaway thin hollow body electrics, single pickup and double pickup. And these guitars did not compete very well with Gibsons. The Gibson ES335 and 330 models were much more popular than the Martin electrics. And as a result, the Martins are really not very highly sought after. They don't have the look that most electric players want. They have de-Armond single coil pickups. And that was at a time when Gibson already had long since had the P90 single coil, but also had the double coil humbucking pickups, which are more popular. And Martin did not make a semi-hollow guitar. These models were all fully hollow, and well, they were laminated top and back, as were the Gibsons, but it was a somewhat thinner laminate, and they just don't really have that rock or R&B sound that a lot of electric players are looking for. As a result, these guitars today are, when available, generally priced at less than it would cost to make a decent replica. So they have really not become highly sought after as collectibles. So while a Martin D28 of the same age would be worth in the range of $6,000 to $7,000, depending on the year. 1961 is worth more than a 65, but still, we're talking about guitars worth easily $6,500 to possibly $7,500 for a Martin D28 that's clean, versus the Martin electrics, depending on the model, but even the best of them are not likely to bring over $3,000. And the F55 with one pickup is more in the range of $2,000 to $2,500 today, but not highly sought after, although they are well made. Scott in Los Angeles, can you please explain in detail what's involved in a guitar setup? How can you tell a good setup from a bad one? And what are the do's and don'ts? Well, the question is perhaps more complex than it might seem. When you're looking to buy a guitar, one of the first things I check, aside from cosmetics and structural stability such as cracks, is I want to see if it's an acoustic guitar, if it has a good neck set angle. And if it doesn't, that's going to be an expensive operation. A neck set on a Martin or Gibson can easily run $700. And if it needs a refret, because if the neck happens, for example, to be twisted or bowed, if it's a Martin, one made prior to 1985, then it does not have an adjustable truss rod. So adjusting a bow in a neck on a Martin, if it's early pre-1985, is likely to involve a plane and refret, and then again, you're getting into about $500. But that's not a matter of setup. That is something above and beyond what I would consider to be setup. But when I'm looking to buy a guitar, I want to see, what is the neck profile? Is it warped? Is it twisted? And does it have a good neck set angle? And how much fret wear does it have? Is it cracked? Because cracks are not a matter of setup. But a lot of people think a neck set is just a setup job. Well, no, it isn't. A setup job, typically, if we get a guitar that's in good condition but needs setup, that means we want to check if it has an adjustable rod. We want to see, does that rod work? And does the neck have proper relief? We're not looking for a neck to be absolutely flat as a ruler. It actually needs a little bit of relief, or a neck that is adjusted to be totally flat for the entire length of the board is likely to buzz. We want to check the action height. And if the guitar has an adjustable bridge, it's easy to adjust that within bounds. But if it does not have an adjustable bridge, then you're likely to end up having to adjust saddle height. But if it needs a neck set, one does not correct the action by simply filing down the bridge or filing down the saddle, when in fact it really needed a neck set. And so far as do's and don'ts, don't file a bridge lower when a guitar really needs a neck set, because when you get done, it still needs a neck set, except now you need a new bridge. And just added greatly to the cost. We want to check nut slot height, so action at the nut, and we want to check intonation. And setup basically involves neck adjustments when under tension. What is the profile of the neck and how adjustable is that? Setting the action height, the string height at the nut, and adjusting intonation. Those are the factors that we consider to be proper for a setup job, and we strongly advise that one should not do unalterable changes on a guitar to greatly modify its originality. But a neck set, to me, is not altering originality. If it needs a neck set, you do a neck set, because otherwise it doesn't play well. John says, I would like to know what George estimates a decrease in value of an otherwise all original vintage guitar except for rewound single coil pickups. So a 63 Fender Strat with bridge and middle pickup rewound, otherwise original, including tuners, frets and nut wiring, etc., was actually done at Gruhn's, where I bought it from. Just curious what guitar would be worth if it was completely original versus now. For one thing, we would not ever rewind a pickup that didn't need it. So there's usually a good reason for doing a rewind, and that is the pickup's dead. If it's not rewound, then it's not usable. So a fully original one is going to be worth more than a rewound one, but a rewound one is worth a heck of a lot more than the dead one. And if it's rewound by an expert, the result will be better than if it's rewound by somebody who doesn't know what they're doing. So not all rewinds are equivalent. A really expert rewind will still not be worth as much as an original, but a general rule of thumb is that since collectors are concerned about originality, the value of the guitar is likely to be reduced by at least 1/2 the price of the value of the original pickup. So it still is the guitar, the body, the neck, the frets, the rest of the wiring is not reduced in value, and the value of each pickup that has been rewound is devalued by 1/2 of what a original pickup would be worth. So the guitar itself is not necessarily going to be very dramatically reduced in value if the job is done well, but it will be reduced by about 1/2 the value of each pickup that was rewound. Jim Leckinger, is there a period of time when heritage guitars were significantly better in quality and or value than they are now? And in my opinion, the answer to that question is no. Heritage has been sold and is under new management, but the new management has done an excellent job maintaining their standards of quality. And I do not feel that there has ever been a time in the history of heritage guitars that they were significantly better or worse than they are now. It is also worth keeping in mind that Gibson closed their factory in 1984 in Kalamazoo, and then several ex-employees who Gibson employees took over the rental of that building and continued to make guitars in there under the Heritage brand name. And these are employees who had made Gibsons primarily during the 1970s through the mid-80s, through 84. These are not the same folks who were busy making the classics of the 1950s. Heritage, in my opinion, never made an electric guitar or an acoustic that truly compared to their golden era Gibsons. But they were certainly guitars that were made fully as well as what Gibson was doing in the 1970s through 84. And Heritage today is working on actually improving quality. So we'll see, but I think it is entirely possible that the best Heritage guitars may be some Heritages, guitars made right now or in the near future. But the new Heritage guitars are fully as good as the older Heritage guitars. Wade Story, when is it time to refret a Gibson guitar? Does installing new frets over the fretboard binding nibs instead of retaining the nibs hurt the value of the guitar? Gibson guitars have had frets that the metal stops short of the binding, and then it was, when they dressed and filed that binding down, the binding next to the fret end was left intact, so they were called little nibs that were right in the center. As the fret ended, the nib continues to the end of the edge of the binding. So there's a small fret nib or binding nib. And when one is refretting a guitar and dressing the fingerboard, commonly enough, it is a process if the fingerboard needs leveling or it's a little bit of twist or some fingernail wear on the board. Often enough the board is dressed, and if you do that, it is hard to maintain those fret nibs. It can be done, but it takes extra effort. does it produce a better job to retain those nibs? In our opinion, the answer is no. In fact, the guitar actually gives you more playing surface of fret if the fret metal extends right the full width of the neck rather than stopping at a nib, because the nib area is not really very playable. So if you're bending notes, I would find it actually more comfortable to play, and overall, I think playability is improved slightly if you don't keep the fret nib in place. But if you have something like a 1959 original Les Paul and you're refretting it because the original frets are extremely worn, then that's a time that you might want to keep those nibs. But when it comes right down to it, it's from a purely utilitarian playing point of view, frankly, the guitar plays better with no nibs. And in my opinion, it is not a crime to remove those nibs when you're dressing the frets and just do an excellent professional quality fret job without nibs and having the fret the full width of the fingerboard. But I would certainly not advocate ever, when refretting, cutting through the binding for fret slots. That is something that we don't do. We do not cut the binding if we're refretting a guitar. Eric Banta, what is your favorite type of pre-CBS Fender Telecaster and why? Model, color, and configurations. Well, in my opinion, the best teles ever made were the early ones, which basically gets down to the black pickguard models of 51 through early 54. The fact that the pickguard is black is not what makes them good, but those are the ones that also have the bridge position pickup with level pole bars, and have the brass bridges, and they're just the best sounding teles I've ever heard. To me, they're some of the finest sounding electric guitars of any model I've ever heard. They are absolute classics. They sound great. There are certainly guitars made later that are good, but if I have to pick the teles that I think are the best ever, that's the ones. But he does have also the question, same question, but limited to post-1980 Telecasters. And my answer there is probably the best Telecasters made since 1980 are being made right now. Custom shop teles and master-built teles made today, so far as I'm concerned, are the best teles made since 1980. And lastly, when looking at any Telecaster, what's the most important aspect of the build or craftsmanship that you think makes it a more high quality playing and sounding instruments? Well, there are so many factors that go into making a guitar good. The wood, well seasoned and generally lightweight body wood, well seasoned neck wood that is structurally stable and dense. Whereas it's good to have relatively dense, heavy neck wood, but also for body wood, often enough what we're looking for is well-seasoned, structurally strong, but lightweight body wood, such that actually the guitar, even played acoustically without plugging it in, sounds vibrantly alive and has good sustain. If it doesn't sound good played without plugging it in, if the tone and playability and just the feel and the sustain isn't good, plugging it in is not going to make it great. It's not going to be as good as one that sounds good acoustically. And a lot of good players try them out acoustically. Even though it's not loud, they can still hear it. They want to hear the ones that sound right acoustically before they even plug it in. Finish, a good lacquer finish rather than a poly finish is likely to sound better. Obviously, quality of pickups and quality of hardware. Every single component and feature of a guitar has an impact on the sound. So the feel is critical so far as neck dimensions. The bridge hardware certainly has a considerable impact on tone and sustain. So these are all important factors. Every factor on the guitar impacts sound. Mark Mattingly in Chattanooga, with the rarity of 1930s Martin shade top or dark top finishes, how do you view their value and collectability comparatively with natural finish models of the same model and year? Martin did some that were just dark tops, and others that were sunburst finish tops. And these are much more rare than the natural finish ones. In general, collectors will pay more for them, but certainly the guitar doesn't play or sound the one iota different as a result of the color of the finish on the top. But there are people who will sometimes put out significantly more money for a sunburst example, particularly for some of the dreadnought models. And in the case of sunbursts, it can be anywhere from 25% to 50% extra. But from a purely player's point of view, there's no difference. But the percentage of sunburst finish Martin flat top guitars in the mid-30s onward, done with the dark finishes, is very small. Interestingly enough, in the 20s through early 30s, there were a moderate number of shade tops, a bit more than they did later on in the 30s. But the same basic rule of thumb still applies, that we do get more money for those that have the shade top or burst. Chris says, I have a 1957 Martin D18 with a serial number verified. Other musicians who play it remark that it seems very light compared to other D18s. Was that a characteristic of that era? The answer is that in 57, they were not especially any lighter than they would have been from other Martin dreadnoughts of the 1940s, right on up through the late 50s. But if you're going to compare them with guitars made during the 1970s, yup, it's lighter, but not dramatically so. It'd be interesting to just weigh it and let me know how much it weighs. And you can just let me know by email, george@guitars.com, and I'll respond to you to let you know whether I would consider that to be a particularly light example. But there's no reason for one particular guitar of that age to be lighter than others of the same age, because they were very consistent in dimension and type of wood. But the fact remains that some pieces of wood are heavier per cubic volume than others, but Martin was pretty meticulous in selecting rather uniform standards of wood, including density. But depending on the growing conditions, pieces of mahogany can vary very considerably, so that two pieces of exactly the same dimension, grown in different areas, different soil conditions, different virgin forest versus secondary growth, can be considerably different in weight. So there is room there for some variation, but it should not be a very dramatic difference in the weight for guitars from the 50s through the 40s. He also asked for 1950s era Telecaster. There are debates about the benefits of replacing the three-piece bridge saddle. With a six-piece, some intonation improvements are minimal, and a three-piece provides more twang, which for me is desirable. Well, how much twang it has is to a large extent going to be a matter of the metal composition of the bridge. And depending on which supplier you get it from, that can be different. So I would say that in general, I would advise keeping them original. But if you do change it to experiment, be sure that you use something that does not require a permanent alteration of the guitar. Fender guitars are built essentially like an erector set, and you can get interchangeable components which will utilize the exact same screw holes. So you can try one out. And for example, if you get something like a Tone Pros brand setup, the Tone Pros components are very good quality. And there are, not all replacement bridges are equal. And if you try something that can be interchanged with no alteration of the guitar other than unscrewing one component and screwing another into exactly the same screw holes, try it out and see for yourself what you like. You won't be hurting it since you can change it back if you wish to. Okay, so again, there's a question of one further thing about when is it time to refret a guitar. And the answer to that is that original frets are desirable. You don't replace original frets unless they really need it. But when frets are so pitted and deeply, so worn, that if you were to dress them out, you'd end up with virtually no fret height. It's time for a new fret or a complete refret if more of them are that way. Or if a guitar has had the frets dressed multiple times in the past, so the frets are just low and relatively flat on the top, there's no room to give it any decent arch, then it is also time for a refret. And a superb quality, very professional refret is still not going to be worth as much as having pristine original frets, but it's worth a heck of a lot more than having original frets that are so worn that they no longer conform to original specifications. And in effect, is it really original frets anymore if you've changed the contour so much that they don't resemble what left the factory? So that is something that is, again, worthy of consideration, that refretting a guitar is often a good thing to do. Dale Hoskin, will a custom shop guitar hold its value better than the same guitar but a regular production? Well, the regular production guitar is not the same guitar as a custom shop model. And we're talking about something like a custom shop Fender versus a standard line Fender. Well, the custom shop model costs more and the specs are not exactly the same. But will it retain value better? Not necessarily. It's sort of like which retains its value better, $5 bills or $20 bills? Well, $20 bills cost more, but either one, if you stick a bunch of them in the same drawer, if you have $100 worth of each of them, they're still worth the same. And the $5 bill retains its value just as well as the $20 bill. And much the same can be said of good guitars. If it's a good quality instrument, it will retain its value very well. If it's a cheap import model that is badly made with a thick poly finish and a truss rod that doesn't work, well, they don't retain much value. But if you're talking about a genuine US made Fender, then one of the less expensive models may retain its value just as well as one of the more expensive ones, but it doesn't start out the same specs. It's not the same beast. So, Chris asks, relative to acoustic guitars, sleeping or losing their tonal quality after lack of use, would this also apply to solid body electrics? Well, 2 points. One is that on an acoustic guitar. If it hasn't been played in a long time, it may go to sleep, but it wakes up plenty quick if you play it hard. If you are in a bluegrass band or old-timey band and you're playing it at considerable volume, that thing is going to wake up fast. And often enough, it may take only a few hours and it's wide awake again. But if you play it with your bare fingers and never really put it through much dynamic range of playing, and play it only very softly, you won't wake it up ever. You play it for the rest of your life, it won't wake up. On electric solid body guitars, I think this is much less of a factor. And is playing going to really wake one up much? I would say no. It's important to have a good quality guitar and to be well set up. Ed Oswood in Woodstock, Georgia. What are the best sources of information on vintage guitars? I have a moderate sized guitar collection that is focused on limited edition and low production number guitars. I have found that it is difficult to find accurate information from manufacturers and dealers. YouTube isn't very reliable either. My lack of knowledge has kept me away from vintage guitars. Well, the lack of knowledge may have kept you away from vintage guitars, but in my opinion, the vintage guitars are the ones that have tended to be the best investments. Limited edition and low production number guitars, in my opinion, are not better investments. So far as information on these limited edition and low production models, there's not much you're going to find in books about them. The main ones you're going to find information on for those will be the manufacturers who produced them. If it's a company like Martin, that's no problem. They can provide you the information on any limited edition model they've made. With Fender and Gibson, the fact is, yeah, it's harder to get information out of them. And the fact that it's hard to get that information actually does limit their real long-term collectability. And if something is low production, you have to figure that companies actually like to make profit. And if something is really low production, it's likely to be something that they really honestly didn't feel that they could sell in larger quantity. There are times I feel that the way they determine how many of something to make in a limited run is to just have their committee sit around and think, well, gee, worldwide, how many of these do you think we could sell? Oh, there's probably not more than 25 people in the world who want one of those. Well, that's what we'll make. And if you don't have accurate information available, you won't find much of that in books. You can find books that cover a great deal of information about vintage guitars, company history. We have a whole library full of books, and if you can go online, you can find there are dozens of books available about guitar history, but very few of them that will cover very much in the way of limited run, non-standard models. But if they're made by major manufacturers, my personal experience trying to resell limited edition guitars, quite frankly, they don't hold their value all that well. I remember very well when the Harley Davidson model, metal body, engraved Fender Stratocaster came out briefly. Some dealers were getting as much as double the list retail price. But if you try to find some of those now, they've actually gone down rather than up. And to have a collection of limited edition models that are made more as conversation pieces or to be put in a glass display case rather than actually used, that's not what made the vintage guitars great or made them collectible. And in some cases, I view it as akin to collecting Franklin Mint replicas of Civil War swords rather than real ones, and then trying to see how collectible they really are and just how well they hold their value. I would have to say the limited edition guitars hold their value better than Franklin Mint replicas of Civil War swords, but do they hold their value as well as the more classic vintage models? And the answer is so far, my experience says the one-word answer to that is no. And having a large collection of guitars that you buy new as limited editions because you're afraid of getting into vintage is not necessarily a great investment. They may be good quality instruments, but especially if you're paying multiples more than the price of an excellent playable instrument from the custom shop or even master build, that's not necessarily a great investment, but that's my experience. And a lot of these limited run things have been made at least since the early 80s. And at this point, 1990 even was already 30 years ago. During the past 30 years, most of these things kept up so far as appreciating well in value? And the answer is no. A few models have, but most of those limited run things have not. Larry Campbell, I would like to know how to tell the difference between Adirondack red spruce and Sitka spruce. I understand Adirondack is a region of the country, and Adirondack red spruce and Sitka spruce were both harvested. Of course, Adirondack and Sitka don't grow in the same area. Adirondack Mountains is part of the Appalachian chain in New York. But red spruce grows all the way from Canada on the East Coast at relatively low elevations to Tennessee to the south, but at high elevations in the Appalachian chain. The Adirondack spruce is lighter in color. It tends to be harder and stiffer. And it ages to a sort of golden color. The Sitka spruce typically has more cross grain figuring and ages to a reddish brown. The tone is different. The Adirondack is the one that was used by Martin up through 1945 and earlier. And it is used now on some of the custom shop guitars and on their authentic series guitars. Still used today on that. There are, however, other spruces that look very similar to Adirondack. European spruce, the Carpathian spruce and Alpine spruce look very, very similar, but tend to be a bit softer. Engelmann spruce, which is Rocky Mountain areas, tends to also look very similar to Adirondack, but it's softer and more flexible. Does not sound the same. On a finished guitar, you can usually look at a guitar on a Martin and know if it's Adirondack or Sitka, because pre-World War II, Martin wasn't using European spruce. And on some of the later ones in the 50s, when they were using some red spruce Adirondack and mostly Sitka, the color is different and the sound is different. So there are periods when Martin did use both, and they tend to be visibly different, but we're not going to have to worry about whether it's Adirondack versus Carpathian or German Alpine spruce, because that's not what Martin was using in the 50s. If it's light color at that time, it's probably going to be the red spruce or Adirondack spruce. It still gets down to, on a finished guitar by an independent builder, can I look at the guitar and instantaneously tell if it's European spruce or Adirondack? The answer is no. But if you are a botanist who can send a sample to get it DNA tested, then that's going to show up quick enough. And there are also some spruces like Lutz spruce, which is a hybrid of Sitka and white spruce, which have ranges that do overlap and have some hybridization between them as well. That can look very similar to the red spruce. And there's also white spruce, another spruce found in Canada and places like Michigan, that looks very, very similar. So, but that's not what Martin was using. So when we look at a Martin, we know pretty well what the wood is, because we know from their own company records what spruce they were using and where they got it. Ken Waltham, I have had Stephen Gilchrist refinish and restore 3 Loar signed F5s mandolins for me over the years. They were all poorly refinished in the past, and Steve's work resulted in a vast improvement. What is your opinion on the depreciation and value of the instrument, considering the high quality of the work performed? Well, the best refinish in the world is still not going to bring as much money as a fully original example, but Stephen Gilchrist is noted as being one of the absolute finest mandolin builders alive today. His work is extremely fine, and his refinish work would certainly be vastly superior to most others. And his refinish work could be clean enough that for the vast majority of people, they would be hard pressed to tell it visually and even from sound versus an original finish. So you'd have a fine instrument, but in my opinion, the value would still be about at least 1/3 less than if it had original finish. So it might be as much as 2/3 as much as it would otherwise if it was original. But it's most refinish jobs will reduce the value of an instrument by at least half. And if you get into something like a Fender Broadcaster guitar, if it's been refinished, its value is cut by way more than half. Or if you have an original 59 Sunburst Les Paul, a refinished job will very greatly reduce its value by more than 50%. So it depends on what model instrument you've got as to how much that refinished job is going to reduce value. But in the particular instance you asked for, my personal opinion is 1/3 less. John, can you speak a little about the Lloyd Loar period F5 mandolins from 1922 through 1924? The F5 mandolins of that period have a master model label, and they have a signature label with the date and the signature from Lloyd Loar, who was Gibson's so-called acoustic engineer. Best evidence we have is that Lloyd Loar did not personally single-handedly design the F5, but the earliest F5s were made with his signature on the label. He left in December of 24. Gibson was going through financial hard times, and one of the things that helped that along, as far as hurting the company, was the introduction of the F5 and the master model series of mandolin, mandola, mandocello, and guitar. They didn't sell well. The mandolin orchestra boom was dying, and the F5 did not sell well until it was popularized by Bill Monroe for bluegrass music, but that didn't start till 1945, so it didn't help Gibson in those days when they made the Loar model, but they are still considered by most people today to be the finest mandolins ever made by any maker in the entire history of building carved top and carved back mandolins. They are great instruments. Jim Miller. My question is regarding the rare New York Epis from 1930, models 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4 in concert and auditorium sizes. I'd love to hear your opinion regarding this instrument, any pros and cons of the build and bracing for these models leading up to the 1930s for Epiphone. If you recall any personal history with said Eppies, I'd like to hear your brief summary of your experience with them. Well, I don't know anybody who's had a great deal of experience with them because all the people who made them have one thing in common, they're now dead. But they were made from the late 20s through circa 1930. And they were followed with a recording series of guitars after that that had asymmetrical bodies. But these first models, the 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4, were pretty standard guitar shapes. The 0 had a flat top, flat back, and the others were carved models with round sound hole. They're extremely rare. We did have a style 4 a couple of years ago, which we sold to Brian Sutton. He likes it quite well, but I would say it's not near as versatile a guitar as most flat tops. And I don't think it really truly replaces an F-hole flat top, F-hole arch top either. But they sound good, but they're so rare, and it's so rare to find one in good playing order that it's hard to generalize much about marketability or so far as which artists use them. The answer is virtually nobody, because nobody has any. There's very few of these around to compare. They were good guitars. In my opinion, were they as well made as Gibson arch tops of the same time? No, I don't think their workmanship was truly equivalent. But I can say at least the style 4 that Brian Sutton got suits him quite well for some styles of music. And it's a good instrument, but these are so rare that finding one is, for most folks, simply going to be an exercise in frustration and futility. I don't know of any currently for sale, but that's not to say you can't find one online. There's all kinds of things. If you look long enough, you may find them. George Scanelli. Today, when I see some guitars that were manufactured in the 50s and 60s, I noticed that some guitar advertisements were boasting gold foil pickups as a selling point. What was it about these pickups? Did they have a unique sound? Just curious. Well, these are pickups that were used by Harmony, and they're okay. Beyond that, I don't have much comment. Are they as good as old Fender and Gibson pickups? In my opinion, no. Are they as good as the old Gretsch Filtertrons? In my opinion, no. But they do have an interesting funky sound, which for some types of funky blues is good. But they were some of the better Harmony pickups of that period. But are they something that I would go out of my way seeking personally? Not especially. John Parsons, living in Nashville, did you get out to local music shows on a regular basis before the pandemic? Are you a country music fan? Who are some of your favorite musicians in Nashville right now? Well, prior to the pandemic, for quite a few years, from 1969 when I first moved to Nashville until the pandemic started, I used to go backstage to the Grand Ole Opry very frequently. In fact, as often as 3 times a week, and sometimes 4, because in recent years they've had Opry Tuesday night, and sometimes one Wednesday. They have had some Thursday shows at the Ryman with the Gatlin brothers as the hosts for those, but they were Opry artist shows. And then Friday and Saturday. So you could go sometimes 5 nights a week. And I, until the pandemic hit, I was typically going backstage to the Opry as much as 3 times a week. And are you a country music fan? And that depends on your definition of country music. This idea that country music is one single entity and that it's all the same just isn't so. Do I like Vince Gill? Absolutely. Vince Gill, Marty Stewart, Ricky Skaggs, Brad Paisley, Keith Urban are great players. Charlie Worsham is a fine player. And these are people I have great respect for, as well as session players like Brian Sutton, Tom Bukovac. Brian Sutton is one of the absolute finest guitar players on planet Earth, as far as I'm concerned. Hard for me to imagine anybody better. He's not performing on the Opry as a headliner, but he certainly has done lots of shows with a variety of players, backing them up in their bands. And he is phenomenal. Tom Bukovac's done so many sessions. It's an injustice to just end it there, other than say, look, there's dozens upon dozens of great, great players in Nashville. I enjoy Riders in the Sky. All the members of Riders in the Sky are great musicians. Doug Green, Fred Lavore, Too Slim on bass, Woody Paul on fiddle, and Joey Misklin on the accordion. They are phenomenal musicians. And they're people I've known a long time that I like. There's lots of friends I have backstage. And these are people I not only may deal with some as customers, but they are friends as well. And I like that style of music. Do I uniformly like every single act on the Opry? No. Some of the stuff on the Opry to me sounds more like rock or R&B, and not even necessarily, some of it I'll have to admit that I do not uniformly claim to like every single act on the Opry. Country music is very diverse. Am I a big fan of some of the older style commercial country western? The fact is, no, it wasn't my favorite. But that doesn't mean that they're bad. It means I have personal preferences. And country music has a very, very wide variety of music. But the bands that I like the best backstage, and the ones that I listen to the most, are the ones that not only have great stage shows, but also tend to have great backstage jam sessions going on. These are people who just love what they're doing. And those are people that I enjoy listening to. I like music that has a considerable degree of improvisational aspect to it, so that you can listen to the same tune that they may do 3 different times at different months or whatever. And Vince may do a tune sometimes with just him and one guitar, or him and the staff band accompanying him, or him and some friends accompanying him. And it can be 3 very different results. And it's really great listening to some of what goes on. There's some tremendously talented people in Nashville. And again, I'd be doing an injustice to just limit it to just these people. You could go on, but Nashville has a great deal happening. Steve Shobe, what's your opinion of covering acoustics like Elvis did with leather on a Martin? Could such an instrument be playable, or was it just for show? Well, yeah, of course it can be playable. It'll sound like it's smothered in a blanket, but is it playable? Yes. If you're playing it with a pickup on it, it might not even sound all that much different. But acoustically, having a thick hand-tooled leather covering on your guitar is acoustically a terrible thing to do to it. But if you look at pictures of Elvis or movies of him, what you see is there was a vocal mic for him. There was no wire coming out the end pin, and there was no mic by the guitar. For him, that guitar was a stage prop. The band provided electrified sound. Elvis provided electrifying vocals, but his guitar was a stage prop. And Hank Snow had a guitar that had a covering like that he used a fair amount. And Hank actually could play, and close enough to the mic, he got an okay sound that way. Hank actually was a competent enough guitar player. But in general, people who put a leather covering on the guitar are doing it for visual appeal. It'll match their outfit or their persona, but they're not doing it for sound. And on an acoustic guitar, it's just greatly reducing its sound capability. Larry, can you comment on Gibson SJ Deluxe 1970s? Everyone says they are not that great. If so, what was the problem with them? Well, what I would say, the early to mid 1970s Gibson flat top acoustic guitars were absolutely horrible instruments. They had greatly changed the specifications from anything they had done previously, and they're certainly not at all like anything they do now. Their neck contours were quite different. Their neck set angle was usually very poor, and they had very shallow bridge, a bridge that was about a quarter the thickness that it should be. They were physically almost unplayable. They had binding that often enough over time would decompose and require rebinding. They, for a while, had a UV curing process for their gluing of braces, and the braces left a dark outline visible from the outside, but they were the absolute worst quality Gibson guitars, acoustic, ever made in the history of the Gibson company. And if you could go through point by point, virtually everything on them was bad. So they were almost unplayable. Most of them have fallen apart by now. And so far as I'm concerned, it's good riddance to them. The Gibson guitars made today are respectable, good instruments, flat tops. And the ones made prior to the 70s were also good instruments. But the early to mid 70s, starting when Norland bought the company and continuing right on through most of the 70s, but certainly especially early to mid 70s, they were truly horrific. Tim Riley, Sydney, Australia. I'm a big fan of the Telecaster. I think when Leo got it right the first time, he actually never improved upon it. I've owned many Telecasters and quite a few Strats. I really find it hard to believe, however, that Leo ever stood the chance of building a better guitar than the Tele or the Strat. What do you really think of his other inventions like the Jazzmaster? I owned a really nice condition 1959 Jazzmaster once, and I never really understood the attraction. Well, I share your opinion that the Tele and the Strat were the best guitars that were ever made during Leo Fender's tenure. And he made a number of changes even in those guitars over the years, but in my opinion, the best Teles were the ones from 51 through early 54. And the Strat, when it came out in 54, was a very well made instrument, but the plastic that they used for the knobs, the pick guards, all the white plastic components, switch tip, were a Bakelite type formula that was unstable, did not wear well, cracked and crumbled, and it wasn't long before they debugged it by replacing that. Also, the earliest wiring scheme on the Tele gave a very, very muddy rhythm position sound, and most players rewire them to give a better rhythm sound. So not everything Leo did, in my opinion, was perfect from the start, but the Tele is really very easy to rewire to specs that sound better for the rhythm position. The other thing Leo did that I find almost unfathomable that he stayed with it all the time, was every model guitar he made had a bridge cover. The ashtray type cover on the Telecaster is something that usually most players take off immediately. Hardly ever see anybody play it with it on. You can't damp the strings with the palm of your hand. This greatly interferes with playing. So regardless of whatever it does for the magnetic field, theoretically it was supposed to sound better with that there. But in reality, nobody seems to be bothered by the sound that it has with that cover off. And the bridge plate has that lip on it to hold the ashtray in place. And I think if I were Leo, I would have quickly given up on the ashtray and redesigned the bridge plate. It would need that lip on the edge. And I certainly think that having those removable bridge covers on Tellys, for that, it's not necessary, but on Strats, Jazzmasters, Jaguars, I just see no reason for them. But the Jazzmaster was supposedly going to be for jazz. It doesn't have a good jazz sound. The bridge that's on the Jazzmaster and the Jaguar, that tremolo system and bridge, is rather unstable for tuning. It's not a great trem system. The trem system on the Strat works a lot better. And overall, the switch system on the Strat and on the Tele also makes more sense. The Jazzmaster and the Jaguar were used by groups like the Ventures, and they had that California surfing sound. And for a while, they sold very well during the 60s. They actually sold better than Telys and Strats did. So were they a commercial failure? The answer is absolutely not. They were very commercially successful when they were first introduced and continued to be successful for quite a while. For Richard Buse, what impact did Ovation have on the acoustic market of the 1970s and 80s? It was very popular when Glenn Campbell played and endorsed one, but the biggest thing that was popular, I think, about them, aside from the Glenn Campbell endorsement, was Ovation was the first company making acoustic electric guitars with a relatively good sounding acoustic pickup. And this was in the 70s, a time when virtually nobody else had a really good sounding plug-in acoustic. And a lot of people were buying Ovations, not because they loved that bowl back, which would slide out of your lap pretty easily, but they bought it because of the pickup. And it had a profound impact on the market. As a result, later, Command Company that produced and owned the Ovation company, Command Aerospace, also took on distribution of Takamine, and the Takamine pickup and the control system, in my opinion, was better than the Ovation system, and actually ended up pretty quickly outselling Ovations. And Takamines continue to this day to sell quite well, but that had a profound impact on the market. And after that, quite a few other companies started making good acoustic electric pickups. And of course, today, there are a heck of a lot of different options in acoustic electric pickups. Denny Rogers says, I've seen some with strings through and over the top of the stop bar on a Les Paul. Is that a good practice, or have just been doing it wrong? Well, it was designed to have the strings going over the top. If you string it the other way, frankly, you can play it either way. The main thing is setting it up where you find the sweet spot for tension downward on the bridge, and cranking it as far down as it can possibly go is not necessarily the best for tone. And it's going to vary a bit on guitar. and the gauge strings, type strings you're using, and your playing style. You can do either one, but what was it intended for? It was intended to go over the top of the stop tailpiece. For Andrew Sarnow, hi George, it's Andrew Sarnow. I spent some time with you and bought a Martin DSS 17 last October. I love the guitar. I want to ask about the break-in time for new guitars and if there are specific years that have stood out for older Martins. Break-in time for a new guitar, if it's really built well in the first place, doesn't have to take very long at all. 1 week of playing pretty loud and hard will break in a guitar remarkably well. And it'll continue to improve over the years. But if it's a good guitar, it's supposed to sound good right out of the box. And things like our new Sinker model custom shop Martins sound great. And they sound good out of the box, but yeah, a few days of playing will wake them up. And even backstage at the Opry, when I used to go very regularly, I'd take a bluegrass guys could get into it. In the middle of his tune, even all of a sudden the guitar would wake up and you could tell within a 5-minute period of, wow, it just went into overdrive and now it's awake. And it doesn't take long. John Chamberlain, Richmond, Virginia, do manufacturers offer their factory seconds to dealers like Gibson once did? The answer is a lot of them don't, but some of them end up at a place called MIRC, which is right south of Nashville, and they get sold to hawk shops and whatever. They don't offer them to music stores, which is a rather fascinating thing. But Martin doesn't produce factory seconds. Gibson once did, but I don't believe they're currently offering factory seconds. Lenny Samzik, please give your comments on pre-refined Parker Fly Deluxe classic guitars and their future value. They are not made anymore. The early Parker Flies are very interesting instruments, very lightweight, including some that were spruce. They're spruce and composite, others are maple and composite, but they're good instruments. And it's, so far they haven't been producing really high prices, but I think they're some of the most innovative guitars I've seen in solid body. And I think they deserve more attention. Time will tell. The same person also asks about purchased a 1961 Gibson Byrdland with PAF humbuckers from me in '78 for $900. Yeah, times have changed. The '78, of course, was also now, that's 42 years ago. And yep, they've gone up. It's hard for me to feel like, yeah, I've been in business for 50 years and some of it seems like yesterday, but I've been in business for over half a century. But he says, unfortunately, he no longer owns it. Any comment on Gibson Florentine Byrdlands from the early 60s or Florentine versus Venetian cut? Well, the Florentine cutaway models are throughout most of the 60s till late 68, and they went back to the Venetian cut, the rounded cut. But the earliest Byrdlands from the 1950s into early 1960 are the rounded Venetian cut, and those will bring the most money. But Byrdlands are a good guitar, but a lot of people are going to still steer clear of most Byrdlands simply because they want a longer scale. The Byrdland has a narrow neck and a 23 1/2 inch scale. And therefore, it's a specialty guitar. But if you play some of the jazz, it has long, long stretches. It was designed for that, and it's great. Jackie Ezel asks, can you explain how your classification of guitars relates to zoology? And I have an academic background in zoology. And in zoology and in botany, it's the study of living creatures and plants. These animals are organized in what's called the Linnaean taxonomic system, where they, in Latin, have a Latin name for the genus and for the species and also subspecies. And this means that if you have a copperhead snake or a cottonmouth snake, well, I know what those are for most folks, but the cottonmouth actually is, some people call it a water moccasin, and some snakes have a range like the milk snakes. The type of king snake has a range from Canada to Brazil, but they have different subspecies along the way and numerous different names. But if you have the Latin name, well, the copperhead is Echistrodon contortix, and the cottonmouth is the same genus. It's Echistrodon piscivorus, which is a fish eater. Guitars, in my mind, I can look at and organize in very much the same classification system that one would use for botany or zoology. There are different makers, and there are different models, and each maker may have flat tops and arch tops and different variations of Martin dreadnoughts. And I use the same basic classification and identification systems and the same methodology of examining an instrument that a zoological or botanical taxonomist would use. A taxonomist is a person who classifies and categorizes and identifies animals and plants. And also there were identification keys, step-by-step process of looking at something to determine what it is. So you can go to some of the texts for zoology and botany, and you have a step-by-step, you get a specimen in front of you, does it have this or this, a series of yes and no questions, and you end up with what is it? And you've come up with an identification. Well, I've done some of that same type of organization for guitars, banjos, mandolins, and ukuleles. So the exact same methodology that I had from my academic background, and frankly, I've been collecting snakes since I was 8 years old, out collecting insects with my dad, who was a pathologist, when I was as young as 4. So long before I went to college at the University of Chicago or did graduate work at Duke, I already was very familiar with the taxonomic system. I knew about that when I was 10 years old. And it applies every bit as well to instruments. I'm a firm believer in biological evolution, but you see also evolution in instrument design, which is impacted by technological change, as well as makers' reaction to changes in economic and demographic change, which results in different type demand. Makers design instruments so people who want them will buy them. And over time, they incorporate technological changes that become available, or technological changes that make it possible to make something quicker or cheaper. And sometimes the technological changes that result in making it quicker and cheaper are not necessarily for the better, but other technological changes can truly result in improvements. But at any rate, I use the exact same skill set to identify an instrument that a zoological taxonomist would. And when buying an individual instrument, I examine it not only from the taxonomist's point of view to determine what is it, but also my father was a pathologist, and I use the exact same methodology that a forensic pathologist would use to look at a body or look at a guitar, banjo, or a mandolin. I want to know what happened to that instrument. And just like a dead human body, it's not there with the person to tell me what goes on, but you can look at it and figure out an awful lot about what happened to that person over the years and what may have done him in the final time. But you can tell a lot about that person's life history by looking at that body. You can tell an awful lot about the history of that guitar, banjo, or mandolin, what modifications has it had over the years. And these things greatly impact the value and utility of the instrument. So before I buy or consign an instrument, it gets the taxonomic inspection and the complete forensic pathological examination. Look forward to next week. and more questions. I have a few that we don't have time for today that will be answered next week. I look forward to however many more questions you folks send in. I enjoy doing this. It's something I really can't rehearse unless you want to consider that I've been collecting instruments for 57 years and had the shop now for 50½ years of total immersion of that. So that's my rehearsal. And I'll look forward to visiting with you folks again next week and continuing it each week onward, as long as there's questions to answer and people who wish to listen in, I'll be here. Thank you.